Welcome, folks. We really appreciate you coming tonight and being with us for this episode of Mountaineers Books web series. I'm Doug Canfield, and we were happy to have tonight Paul Souders with us. Paul will be telling stories from his new book, Arctic Solitaire, A Boat, a Bay, and the Quest for the Perfect Bear. This is a tale of an obsession to shoot the perfect polar bear photo. Of course, we all know there are obsessions that don't include animals with large teeth, but hopefully we'll learn how that all worked out for Paul, as well as what he went through to find the perfect polar bear in the first place. Paul is a professional photographer whose work for the past 30 years has taken him all over the world. His images have appeared in a wide variety of publications, including National Geographic, Time, and Life magazines in the US, and Geo in France and Germany, as well as hundreds of other publishing and advertising projects. He won the BBC Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition in both 2011 and 2013. Also in 2013, he won the National Geographic Photography Contest, and in 2014, the grand prize in the Big Picture competition. As an adventure photographer, Paul admits to having been slapped by penguins, kissed by dolphins, head-butted by walrus, terrorized by lions, menaced by vertebrates, large and small. He once spent 27 hours digging the safari truck out of the Serengeti mud using only a saucepan, and he says he has the best job in the world. Paul's presentation will run about 30 minutes this evening, followed by a question and answer period, and you can feel free to submit your questions at any time during the presentation in the question box that you can see on the right side of your screen. So that's the intro. Let's get started. Over to you, Paul.
Doug, thanks very much. It is great to be here tonight, and I'm really honored to have a chance to share my story with Mountaineers Books. You know, I will be the first to admit that I am a lucky guy. Pretty much my whole life, I've got paid to take pictures. But after 3 decades at this, I'm pretty sure that all the easy pictures I've already taken. I'm here to tell you, though, that there are still some crazy ones left out there. And tonight I'd like to share some stories about what happens when you go a little off the deep end and spend 4 summers chasing a few of the craziest ones. It feels like I've spent half my life on my hands and knees chasing some poor critter around through the muck, and the other half getting chased myself by something that wants to eat me. All of which is weird because it's not like I ever set out to be a nature photographer. Where I'm from, nature is mostly junk cars, poison ivy, and rusted barbed wire. When I turned 13, I announced to my poor sainted mother that when I grew up, I wanted to be a freelance news photographer. And I could see her working her way down the list. It's like from doctor to lawyer to professional assassin. And then she kind of got to the dark basement where my dreams lived. And the look on her face, it was like the death of hope. I went off to college, but it did not stick. Moved back into my folks' basement and got a job in the hometown carpet factory. It didn't take long to see that I was not put on this earth to learn a trade, raise a brood, and make an honest living on the factory floor. Instead, tail between legs, I scurried back to college and pretty soon found work at a small paper in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I showed up that first day on the job thinking I was bound for journalistic glory. The only thing I was missing was the official war correspondence patch on my members only leather jacket. I just knew they'd see my raw talent and put me on the next plane out to go shoot some picturesque combat or scenic third world squalor. They had other and, upon reflection, probably better ideas and sent me to the county fair. I went on to shoot an endless string of Friday night high school football games and 4th of July parades, and if I got lucky, maybe somebody's house burned down. I was looking for a change of scene and never one for half measures, and I migrated north, took another newspaper job up in Anchorage, Alaska. My new boss was a man with a sense of humor, and he was more than happy to send me off to sample some of Alaska's quirky sub-zero charms. I still had to cover my fair share of the daily news staples, but there were also mornings where I'd wake up and find a moose on the front porch, bald eagles on the drive to work, I grew up between a trailer park and a chicken farm, so this was all new to me. Yeah, but I was drawn to the landscapes and the critters I saw. I spent more and more of my time on and off the clock exploring, taking pictures of the wilderness that surrounded me in Alaska. But I was pretty sure I was going to die of old age before my bosses at the paper, let alone the editors at National Geographic, got around to paying me to shoot the kind of assignments I wanted to do. I figured it might just be easier to spend what money I had and just go. I mean, that's what God made credit cards for, right? I left my steady paycheck behind and soon fetched up in Seattle. I started with baby steps. Mount Rainier was right outside my apartment window. I could hop in the old VW camper, and Yosemite or Monument Valley were just down the interstate. I made just enough money each month from photo sales to keep the lights on and keep moving. I bought my first plane ticket 20 years ago now. I was flew in steerage from Seattle to London and on to Cape Town, South Africa. I found a beat up rental and headed out on safari. I guarantee I didn't know a damn thing about Africa that I hadn't seen on TV. But for 6 weeks, I lived on a diet of lemon cookies, Simba brand potato chips, and a tin curry that looked, smelled, and I'm pretty sure tasted like cat food. But the whole time, I found this new world of large and dangerous animals whose patience I sorely tested. In between road trips, I spent a decade of summers puttering around in undersized inflatable Zodiacs across the coast of Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. They weren't much more than blow-up rafts with an outboard on the back, but I could carry a week's worth of food and gas and all the camera gear I was willing to ruin. It made sense in so many ways. I mean, it was cheap. It took absolutely no skill. I could go anywhere. And yet it was so cold and miserable and dangerous that nobody was ever going to follow me. I traveled thousands of miles of wilderness coastline. And the entire time, I thought I was cheating death at every turn. It occurred to me I drank like a fish and swore like a sailor. And what I needed next, more than money in the bank or the comforts of home, was a real boat. There was one small hitch. And in the book I write, this might be a good time to point out, I hate boats. I hate the smell of them. I hate the cloying dampness, the sea-sickening bobbing cork lurch. I am hardly the first to observe that life at sea offers all the joys of prison time with worse food and better odds of drowning. Yet even as my brain and my accountant shouted, no, 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 my heart said, oh, hell yeah. It was more dumb luck than any real research that led me to the Sea Dory boats. They're built just up the road from Seattle, and these rugged fiberglass cruisers are perfect for a weekend fishing trip in the San Juans anyway. They were small enough to haul on a trailer, but they had a small cabin to keep the rain out, and they held a small bed, a table, and a kitchen, everything I'd need. And it was like my old VW camper, simple and functional. I bought the first boat I laid eyes on, of course. Pastor Kirby, the owner, had christened her Seasick, which is a pretty funny joke, at least to us Lutherans. She looked almost new, and I half expected the good pastor to tell me he'd only driven at her church on Sundays. I was already fish on. He did not have to reel me in. I soon learned that boating exists in that gray area between a very long camping trip and being officially homeless. I mean, it seemed like I didn't bathe for a week. I crapped in a bucket, slept on a fold-out sofa, drank too much, and spent days talking to nobody but myself. Still, I was all perfectly happy to spend those first few years working my way slowly up the nautical learning curve. On top of all those solo boat trips, I also chartered expedition yachts with real captains to take some more ambitious trips. I went to places like Antarctica to see and photograph penguins, and up to Spitsbergen in Arctic Norway to photograph polar bears for the first time. It turns out that real boats cost real money, and I could never afford to go alone. So I dragged along anybody who'd pay. One or two of them even remained friends after all the yelling was done. I'll admit, I own a lot of the blame. I can be difficult. I'd stand up on deck for hours at a time, staring off at the far horizon with my 1,000-yard stare, looking for bears. When I spotted something, I'd give a quick nod of my chin to show Skipper the new course and say simply, bear. No wonder everybody hated me. So it was before mutineers set me adrift on a passing ice floe. I looked at Seasick. and wondered if I couldn't cut out the middleman and take her north, go see polar bears on my own terms, and live among them for weeks or months at a time. A trip like that could and really should take years of preparation, gathering skills and experience and gear, and with enough time, anybody in their right mind would come to their senses and stay home to catch up on the yard work. For me, it's always made more sense to just go before the doubts creep in or the bills come due, and figure it out along the way. I wanted to walk out my front door and travel overland all the way to the Arctic Circle. I dug up my old road atlas and did some planning. I figured you can take the interstates to the Trans-Canada and up into the Rockies and over the prairie through the north woods of Manitoba until I got to a town I'd never heard of along a river I didn't know existed, and it led to a cold and mysterious sea, Hudson Bay. You can also, you don't have to do the expensive special effects. You can just use Google Maps. I turned our garage into ground zero for the planning. I bought food like I was some survivalist hoarder prepping for the end of days. I bought powdered eggs and canned ham, dried fruit, and salted nuts. I bought canned bacon in a can. This is stuff you wouldn't eat in the last hours of the zombie apocalypse. I had a pile of cameras and lenses and a pile of Pelican cases and crammed one into the other until it all fit. I still needed to clean the walrus snot off my underwater camera. And then I needed to go out and buy a new drone for aerial shots and dig through the scrap heap of tripods and clamps and cables and mounts. I'd once thought polar bears were stone cold killers. I could just see some bear climbing over C6 gunnel like it was one more iceberg bursting through the cabin door. And come morning, there'd be nothing left of me but a smear of blood, a pile of dirty long johns, and that can of bacon still untouched. Looking back, I may have gone a little nuts because all of a sudden I owned a portable electric fence, and then I bought a little pen-sized flare launcher, which was like the worst James Bond gadget ever. It's a pen that goes bang, but not very loud. And in the end, I went way outside my comfort zone and brought along a 12 gauge too, with a stash of noisemaker shells they call bear bangers, and a small box of rifled lead slugs in case it all went terribly wrong. In the 4 summers I was up there, I never shot anything more serious than a passing iceberg, and I missed that. When I got everything packed into the boat and the truck, I made an agonizing 17-point U-turn back and forth, blocking traffic on our little street for what felt like a week. And I pulled over and held my wife Janet in my arms. "I'll call you when I get there," I sniffed, eyes brimming. We've been doing this dance for years now. I have to milk these departures for every ounce of drama. Janet, the healthcare professional, knows you tear off a Band-Aid in one swift motion. She looked at me and said, "You're driving to Spokane tonight. It's 6 hours, but by all means." It was 4 days of mind-numbing highway monotony, and then the road ended at a dirt trail down to the riverbank. That was the boat launch. I'd been told there was a channel out there somewhere, but through all the silt and mud, I couldn't tell where. I backed seasick in, loaded her up, and started the motors. Then we headed out into swift, deep water. The wilderness around me, it seemed vast and empty, but I was encased in a glowing cocoon of technology. I had not one but 2 GPS to show me the way. I may not have known what I was doing, but I could tell you exactly where I was doing it. I had radar in case of fog, a depth sounder for the rocks below, and I carried a special satellite beacon that the sales guy had promised would, at the touch of a button, supply my coordinates and my credit card information to the nearest rescue helicopter. Later on, I ran into Inuit hunters who tap the side of their heads and say, "My GPS is right up here." Make no mistake, I admire anybody who could find their way across a trackless wilderness like that. But then again, growing up, I could usually find my way home just by following the smell of chicken shit and the trail of broken beer bottles. Out on the bay, though, I was just one blown fuse or loose wire away from starring in my own Arctic remake of Tom Hanks in Castaway. Hours later, when I rounded a bend, the steep banks and forest gave way to nothing. I could see open water out on the far horizon, Hudson Bay. Huh, I thought, that wasn't so hard. And then it was. The depth shallowed up fast, and I heard the first crunch of boat on rock. Seasick scraped hard against the shallows until we stopped, grounded. Okay, I wasn't likely to sink or drown in 2 feet of water, but we were stuck 50 river miles from another living soul. And at some point, everybody gets stuck. Shackleton got stuck. But my big polar expedition, I was stuck before I even got to salt water. I hadn't yet learned that you set up a camera before you're going to do something stupid, so I just jumped out into knee-deep water and started pushing. This went on for hours. I ground through the shallows and finally pulled her along by a rope. It was like I was dragging a stubborn dog. It was after 11 until I finally floated her free and found a spot to drop the anchor. The sky was still too bright for stars, but I poured myself a slug of whiskey to settle my nerves and stepped outside to join the mosquitoes on deck. It's an old ritual when I'm feeling lonely or down. I raised a toast to absent friends, took a drink, and then poured that last thimble into the river, a small offering to the gods. You know, they call it Hudson Bay, but it's a vast inland sea. It's 600 miles long and up to 400 miles across, and there's a huge range of tides. I mean, the water drops 30 feet from high tide to low. The coastline is flat, and when the wind blows, which is roughly always, there isn't a tree or a hill in half 1,000 miles to stop it. I motored eventfully north. It's more than 800 miles of coastline between the mouth of the Nelson River and the Arctic Circle. That's a little like a trip from Seattle to San Francisco if you replaced I-5 with an uncharted ocean full of icebergs and your car with a floating crack bucket. I was down to my last few gallons of gas when I finally got into Churchill, self-proclaimed polar bear capital of the world. There weren't any polar bears in July, but they did have a gas station, so $900 poor, we continued north. It's a long way between fill-ups. You know, there's just half a dozen villages on 600 miles of empty coastline. To save fuel, I motored at only 5 or 6 knots, which is either a fast walk or a very slow run. I sat at the helm and I steered by hand 12 or 13 hours a day. You know, I wish I could say I was the bear whisperer, you know, that I had some crazy Zen mastery where the wind would carry my whispered prayers from chapped lips to their fuzzy bear ears. If there's a secret to finding a polar bear in a sea of ice, nobody shared it with me. You know, I was just a matter of grim determination, looking at every piece of ice for hour after hour with a pair of big binoculars stuck to my head. Most of the time, nothing. One day, though, off in the distance, I could just make out a white dot like a seagull asleep on the water. Through binoculars, I saw it was a polar bear. It was miles offshore. The way he was headed, it was like the nearest land was more than 40 miles off. I let the big boat drift and set out in my Zodiac. Okay, I never want to stress a bear. They got problems enough. They do not need my help. So I moved on a slow matching course, and I just wanted to see if he might get curious. Yeah, he got curious. Pretty soon I had a big bear paddling right alongside my little rubber boat, less than 10 feet away. I reminded myself, not for the first time, if you mess this up, you die. I had an underwater camera on a long boom, and I lowered it into the water, less than a yard from the bear's head. He swam past. I pulled forward and tried again, and this time he stopped and glared at the big dome. I don't know who was more surprised, him when he saw his reflection, or me when he smacked the hell out of the camera with his paw. Okay, I can take a hint. When I looked, it wasn't a bad photo. The bear's mouth was open, claws outstretched, sunlight glinting off his eye. But I'd also been shooting blind, just holding the camera out on the pole. And I managed to crop off half his head at the edge of the frame. I wonder if I shouldn't just shut up and tell people I did that on purpose. I've been out searching for the pack ice for more than a month when I woke up one morning and found it stretched out in front of me. It was a wall of white. This was the stuff of Hudson and Franklin and all the other explorers' nightmares. Big British naval ships of the 19th century, bigger and stronger than poor little Seasick, had come to grief in that same ice. And I turned tail and ran. For days, though, it felt like I was being followed. And when I finally rowed to shore for a better look, ahead I could see nothing but thick pack ice to the far horizon. I thought, well, that's not good. But when I turned around, I could see the bay behind me was filling in ice too. And in the book, I write, like enormous piece, jigs, pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle, icebergs large and small began to assemble themselves into a solid mass, blocking my retreat. I took off at a dead run towards shore, leapt into the dinghy, and rowed madly back to Susa. On board, I started driving frantically through, around, and over the gathering ice, looking for any way out. Horrible crunches and grinding noises filled the cabin as I scraped through narrowing passages. It sounded like the fiberglass hull was splintering beneath me, and I waited for geysers of freezing water to start gushing in. If I stayed out there, the pack would take us wherever it wanted. I could spend days, weeks trying to push my way out of there. A 4,000-pound boat against a million tons of ice. I had better odds peeing over the side and melting my way out. There was just one small patch of gravel on shore. At this point, I had run seasick aground more times than I cared to admit. I'd never done it on purpose. I pulled the outboards halfway up out of the water and drove her right up on the beach. I thought the ice sounded bad, but rock against it was like something dying. I killed the motor and jumped out and did the only thing I could think of: get the satellite phone and call home. My wife, who has a real job, was working, and I left her one of those lost climber on Everest just calling to say goodbye voicemails. I gave her my latitude and longitude and then asked, honey, could you do me a favor and look up the boat insurance policy numbers? She loves it when I do stuff like that. Then, like any good castaway, I went for a look around my little island. Ice stacked up 15 or 20 feet high along shore. And pretty quick, I found some polar bear tracks, big as a dinner plate, followed them up into the hills. I froze when I saw a piece of fur, polar bear fur. A few steps on, though, I found a skull and a scattering of bones. There's fireweed poking up through the mats of hair, and I could tell that she'd been there for years, probably, bleached white by sun and wind. I tried to imagine her, an old matriarch living through 25 winters or more. She probably reared and fed and protected dozens of cubs through her long life. When I finally turned to go, I stopped to glass the ice again. That's when I saw the other bear, the live one. It was a couple miles offshore, head held high, sniffing the air and walking across the moving ice, straight toward Seasick. With the boat high and dry on the beach, I had no place to go and nowhere to hide. I set off downhill at a trot, clutching the 12 gauge. If that bear got to the boat ahead of me, or worse, caught me out in the open. All this time looking for bears, and now I didn't want anything except for this one to go away. I hit the beach at a dead run and jumped over the gunwale. Once inside, I grabbed more bear bangers, and then I counted out 6 other shells, the lethal lead slugs I kept stowed away, and stacked them in a neat row, just in case. A polar bear's nose is the stuff of legend. They can smell a ring seal 20 miles through a blizzard. I could see him taking little sips of air like a wine snob. Spoiled food, leaky gas cans, and getting a little bit of nasty laundry there until he got to me, Mr. Scared and Stinky. Apparently that's too much even for him because he spun on his heels and walked off the way he came. Towards sunset, when the tide came back in and it loosened enough ice for me to weave through. When I finally dropped anchor and called home again, the first words I heard on the satellite phone were, "Don't ever leave a message like that again." Over the next few days, hundreds of walrus came drifting in with the ice. And when there's ice and there's walrus, there's going to be bears. In the book I described, I found the day's first polar bear, blood smeared and looking pissed off, not long after setting out. In a moment, I saw the second bear of the day, molars deep in a walrus who was clearly past all sorrow. And the morning's third bear was swimming out from shore, intent on joining the fun. I grabbed my cameras and hopped into the Zodiac. It was good, bloody fun. It was great. And I sat there for a long time, watching and photographing the scene. All the characters were there. King of the North, victorious and smeared in gore. Walrus, defeated, dejected, and partly devoured. And the jealous rivals waiting in the wings to steal his prize. They could have sold tickets. Finally, that feeding bear was just harassed by the competition and began to drag the walrus to the edge of the iceberg. He backed into the water, and even as I was saying, "Oh man, you don't want to do that," he pulled the 1,000-pound carcass in after him. It turns out that dead walrus don't float. A week later, when it was time to go home, I hauled Seasick up out of the water and left her parked beside a friend's sled dog lot, wrapped her up in acres of blue tarp, and left for the winter. Sometime around Easter the next spring, boxes started showing up on our front porch, first singly and then in pairs, and finally great heaps of the things. More food, new gear, new camera lenses, fresh long johns. Janet watched this all with just one eye keenly arched. But for me, every day felt like Christmas. And once I headed back north and unwrapped Seasick, it was like the biggest present of all. Once I had everything stowed and had her hauled back to the water, I went back to work. At 5 knots, you have plenty of time to torture some metaphors. I decided this wasn't just looking for a needle in a haystack. This was more like a vast field of haystacks set in motion. There might be a needle, there might not. And by the way, the needle, it wants to eat you. Once in a while, I'd get lucky and spot a polar bear swimming in the ice. When one climbed up on a small berg, I thought he might be the one, the perfect bear. It was all there. I mean, big alpha male standing on his own iceberg framed under a blue, flawless sky. I could see the picture in my head, but I had to change the lens. It should be instinct by now after all these years, but I still had to take my eyes off the bear and look down to make sure the lens lined up right. By the time I looked back up, I had drifted less than 10 feet of the bear. It was an easy jump from his iceberg to my lap. He wouldn't even have to get his paws wet. I was lifting the camera, finger on the shutter, blindly firing off frames. The bear, he stood his ground for just a second longer, and when I finally got the camera to my eye, I could see it. Nothing but lens cap. Weeks could go by without a picture worth the time it took to pick up the camera. But once in a while, just like that, a polar bear would pop up out of nowhere. In the book I talked about, this wasn't just any bear. This was the bear you did not want to meet alone in a dark alley. She took one look from across a mile of broken ice and made a beeline towards me. I slid the window open and leaned out to photograph her, first with a big telephoto, then with the medium zoom, and finally with my wide angle. She filled each frame so fast, I lost nerve, jumped back, and slammed the window shut. She stared at me through the glass, and I had a pretty good idea what a seal feels like in those final seconds before the lights go out. But she looked innocent, like she just dropped by to borrow a cup of sugar. A day or two later, I found another big polar bear swimming lazy and full of seal. I drifted in closer, had one eye on the bear while I lowered the underwater camera in. He growled and I hit the shutter just as he snapped, fangs cracking at the dome. I kept drifting forward and his head was big as a horse. And then he clamped his teeth into the side of the inflatable thin rubber skin and bit down hard. There was a huge whoosh of air and the bear swam one way and I started back the other. The boat was already sinking out from under me. You know, inflatables, they should still float with a hole in one tube, and mine did, but it was not pretty. It felt like I was driving a kiddie pool back to Seasick. There's nothing to do but haul the boat out and then start rummaging around trying to remember where I put the patch kit. But most of the time, I swear to you, the bears didn't scare me half as much as the weather up there. I had plenty of time stuck in one miserable cove or another, cowering from storms, scribbling in my journal. A sample? The wind returned like a jilted lover in some bad country song, howling with rage, waving a pistol, and busting up the furniture. I had a lot of time on my hands. For fun, I'd go outside and check the wind speed. I had a small handheld anemometer, and I held it up like a lighter at some AC/DC concert. One morning, it was only blowing 25 knots, gusting 30, and I could hear the words forming in my head. Is that all you got? And it was like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in Ghostbusters. I had conjured the demon and it could not be undone. Pretty soon my 75-pound Zodiac was doing cartwheel, flipping back and forth in the gale for days on end. That's a lot of audio, sorry. Anytime I ran into Inuit hunters out on the water or in their skiffs, um, the first question always seemed to be, "You aren't Greenpeace, are you?" Memories are long up there, and local folks are suspicious of any anti-hunting or animal rights campaign that might stop or interfere with their traditional lifestyle and hunt. I kept any qualms I had to myself and just stayed out of people's way and tried to stay out of trouble. One night, a canoe pulled up alongside. We got the usual Greenpeace thing out of the way, and I put on the kettle, made coffee, and dug out some jerky. The oldest man was a burly guy named Michel. He sat on the canoe's gunwale and spoke to me quietly, without a hint of rancor in his voice. He looked out at the barren coastline and just told me flat out, there are no factories here, no forests, no mines. We take our living from the sea and from the land. That's what God has given us. During that last summer, time was winding down before I had to turn south. It had been weeks of thick ice, gray skies, and no bears. And then suddenly the sun burst through the clouds just before sunset. I took the Zodiac out for one last look, but I didn't expect to find anything. Yet I hadn't gone a quarter mile before I spotted the polar bear and her cub. They were swimming, the cub paddling a few yards back, and his mother waited for him to catch up. Then he crawled onto her back for a lift. The sun was glowing orange from beneath the dark storm clouds, and it lit the mother and cub like Renaissance saints. When they climbed onto an ice floe, the cub tucked in under his mom's belly and looked back at me with eyes filled with wonder. When the two swam off toward a nearby island, the light was fading. I stopped taking pictures and simply watched them grow smaller until they were lost in the distance. It felt like a parting gift. And by the time I got back to Seasick, I let rip with one loud, long, and very un-Lutheran rebel yell. It was time to head for home. I looked at the charts over and over, but the numbers did not change. It was still a very long way back to Churchill. I spent day after day motoring slowly south. One of my engines died, and I went that much slower. One of the scariest places on the entire coast is Wager Bay. It's less than 15 miles across, but almost 100 miles deep. And during big tides, you get crazy white water currents. It's more like a river than a body of water. Locals talk about whirlpools that'll suck down a big polar bear or a small boat. An old Inuit hunter once told me that before you cross, you should confess in a loud voice all your sins. I wanted to get into the spirit of things, so I worked my way down the list. Pride, lust, greed, vanity. Looking back, I might have skipped a couple, because as soon as I left the safety of shore, I could see the gods were angry, and their anger, it turned to rage. Big waves came from every direction. Seasick wallowed and pitched. None of this was new, but this felt different. I mean, this was sinister. Inside the boat, crap went flying everywhere. And overhead, I could hear my roof box, mounted with 4 big steel clamps. It was starting to break apart. And when it fell overboard, all I could do was watch it go. Waves lifted the bow, and I could see nothing but sky, followed by a second of weightlessness, and then a horrible crash, and we slammed down hard. I was as scared as I have ever been. And the next step was blind panic. I figured I should hold off until Seasick finally turned turtle on me. If it came to that, I figured I would have earned the right to flap my arms and scream like a little girl for however long I had left. But when you're scared, you sometimes forget that boats are built to float. I cleared the tides, the sea calmed, the storm passed. By the time we dropped anchor that night, the skies above were clear and filled with stars. I poured out that last medicinal whiskey and sat up on deck beneath the stars. Off to the north, there were curtains of green aurora flickering across the sky. It was like pale ghosts dancing. I had gone north with a simple goal. I wanted to make the best polar bear pictures ever. I thought I was the man who would chase these pictures to the edge of the world and over it if need be. If those 4 summers on Hudson Bay taught me anything, it's that I wasn't that guy anymore. Maybe I never was. But there wasn't much point in sitting around and moping about all the pictures I'd missed. Come morning, you know, one last time I raised a toast to Franklin and Shackleton and all the other ill-prepared and ill-fated explorers from the heroic age. And in the morning, I put on my big boy pants, pointed C6 south, and pushed on, eventfully, home. And that is the end. I'd like to thank everybody here at Mountaineers Books. They are an independent and nonprofit publisher of travel, adventure, and environmental titles, and they saw this thing through to creation. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We really, that was great. And your pictures are so amazing. We have a couple of questions for you. Allison asks, how did you handle the long periods of solitude?
Well, I mean, you don't go off alone on a boat unless you are well used to the voice in your own head. I mean, I'm really happy to be out and immersed in the wilderness. I mean, it's kind of like there's times when I think I'm my best self out there. I really enjoy it, and I can focus on the work and the experience and just kind of drinking really deeply from all my senses, if that makes sense. And then and the other half of that is I know I have a home to go back to, and that anchor is what makes it all possible. I mean, I really do think if I didn't have a wife I loved and a home, that I would wind up going off the edge of the earth.
Well, that's a happy thought. Let's see. Let's move on. We'll move on to Eric. He wants to know, aside from polar bears, what other wildlife did you see?
I saw, I mean, tons of walrus. When the ice came in, you really could see literally hundreds of walrus. It was like going back in time. They would gather up on ice pans and just do one big pig pile. And certainly the great thing about walrus is they are a lot easier to find than a polar bear. They're big and brown. There's a bunch of them on a piece of ice. They're great. There were tons of ringed seal and bearded seals, and lots of bird life, and kind of I was up there for 4 summers, and it was late in the season. And every time I would see these huge flocks of snow geese starting to head south, and I would feel like they were trying to make a point that it was time to head for home.
Hey, well, actually, I'm going to just interject my own question. Did you fish? Did you eat fish? Is it that one form of sustenance that you had on this trip, on your trips?
We're going to go webcam. There we are. Hey, I want everyone to notice first how much I have not changed since 1983 when I had my first press pass picture taken. But as far as fish go, and a couple of times folks, yeah, actually were very generous. I was coming out of Arviat, the first village in Nunavut, and someone just stopped and offered me this beautiful, brand new, practically, fresh from the net Arctic char that I ate for 3 days straight. It was brilliant. And a lot of the other time, though, I was just I was trying to stay out of folks' way and be out there and kind of just self-sufficient. So I did carry my own provisions. So whether it was, pasta, sauces in a jar, or soup in a can, it was pretty meager. I mean, if I got stuck someplace, then I could, make cornbread and chili or gumbo or something. But most nights I was so tired, it would just be like can of soup on the 1 burner stove and suck it down fast and fall over asleep.
Okay, we have a question here. How do you plan, in other words, the planning process to be financially able to do something like this? This person says, I'm sorry I came in late. How long were you in Alaska?
I was up there for 5 years. I worked for the Anchorage Daily News between 1989 and 94. And then I've been a freelance photographer ever since then. And I worked with some picture agencies, and they licensed my pictures, and we split the royalties. And for a long time, that was my business model. That's how I made a living. And that it's a little bit of a hand-to-mouth existence, but it was a chance for me to not be bound down by, by a steady check or by a steady employer.
Did we lose your sound? We lost your
Maybe having a
sound.
technical issue
Oh,
here.
there we go.
I
Okay.
take off my
Thanks, folks,
glove.
for letting us know.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. That it was about planning financially. I think, the last week.
Yeah, for me, it's just been kind of a hand-to-mouth deal all along. Um, I made um, enough money from photo royalties to save up and buy a boat and do these trips. And I would, just kind of plan ahead a little bit, and all my grocery money would be spent in the spring when I ordered provisions, and then I'd get up there to wherever I was going. I'd fly into Rankin Inlet and go north from there, and I'd resupply with fresh stuff. But hopefully royalty money came in every month, and I spent it as quick as it. Tried to keep ahead of the credit cards and make sure the mortgage was paid and the light stayed on.
And there's those cans of bacon. They can't be
Can't
cheap.
can't make that stuff last forever.
Virginia asks, with climate change, I've heard that some bears are going after non-traditional, non-seafood, for example, birds on cliffs. And she asked, did you witness anything like that?
I didn't see. I saw pretty. Well, that's not true. I mean, the bears go to shore. Hudson Bay, there isn't any multi-year ice. I mean, pretty much the entire bay melts out at some point in the summer. I was up at the very northern edge of that, but and you see a lot of bears on shore, and they would, I'd see them going through Arctic tern, Arctic tern's nest on the ground, and they would go through and just mow down those little tern eggs and any chicks they found. I heard that they'll go after snow geese when they're on the nest. And in other places, I've actually seen them hunting for seal on the rocks. Usually, I mean, polar bears evolved to hunt on ice, but they're sneaky and smart, and they will go after anything that they can find. And actually saw one take a seal off the rocks on the coast of Labrador last summer. So they're adapting, or they're smart and canny, but as they evolve to hunt defenseless baby seals on the ice, that is their prime source of food, and that's how they can put on enough weight and to survive the long, hungry summer months.
Michelle asks, what was your go-to camera for those wild, wet conditions?
I'm a Canon shooter, and I have pretty much the Canon 1DX was my favorite camera for this stuff because it has great waterproofing. It's fast, the focus is great, and I used it with pretty much for any of the tight stuff. It was either a 500 millimeter lens or Canon's 200 to 400 zoom, which is going to be the most boring conversation, but that's pretty much what I used for that. And then I used an Aquatech underwater, like a housing with an acrylic dome, and that's what I did most of the underwater stuff with. So it was either the 1DX or Canon 5D in that, and then you sort of put that on a 6-foot pole with a trigger, and that's how I did the underwater pictures.
Michelle also has the last question, and that's, are the Inuit concerned about the loss of polar bears and ice due to warming? You had interesting interactions with Inuit. They were suspicious of you, as I recall.
Yeah. I mean, it was, they are, they're very suspicious of any outsider who comes up there. I think they're very sensitive to how they're portrayed in the media to outsiders. They are very suspicious of, like, somebody comes up unannounced, uninvited, in what by local standards is a big fancy boat, and is wandering around taking pictures. And if I was in their shoes, I looked suspicious to me too. I mean, it all seemed a little odd. And I went out of my way on a one-to-one level to explain to folks who I was, what I was doing. I showed them my pictures, showed them published work, and tried to allay their suspicions. That said, there were folks who were not happy I was there and made it abundantly clear. But at the same time, I mean, I was almost with rare exception treated with incredible hospitality. There was a question in there. What they think about polar bears is, I think, again, it's kind of a mixed bag. Traditionally, they have a very close spiritual relationship with the bear, and they've hunted bears for as long as there have been people there. And at the same time, they live in a village, and as more bears spend more time on shore and are hungrier, those bears are attracted to the villages, to the dump, to the smells of food, to the hunting, to the carcasses that are around villages. And there are those conflicts, where like bears come in and people, they get a bear that's stalking children in a playground is going to get shot. And that's, I don't think it'd be any different here in Seattle or in Repulse Bay or anyplace else in the Arctic. And it's a terrible thing, and you really want, people try to haze bears there, in Churchill, where they get a lot of bears in the fall. They have rangers who every day are out firing bear bangers and hazing bears, trying to keep them away from people, to try to keep them separate.
Okay, we've come to the end of our questions. I thank you very much, Paul. That was a lot of fun. I absolutely loved it. And thank you, thank you, audience, for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. And Arctic Solitaire is a narrative and a really great read, but it's also illustrated throughout with Paul's amazing photos. And you got a taste of those today. And just a taste also of the many stories that he has packed into this book, and you got a sense of his humor. I found it laugh out loud, so I think you'll like it. We have some books to give away as prizes, and we'll let the winners know about that in the next couple of days. But if you don't win one of those, you can buy Arctic Solitaire wherever books are sold, and also on our website, mountaineersbooks.org. And if you use this code, the code is POLAR, POLAR, you'll receive a 20% discount. Again, that discount code is POLAR, POLAR. But if you don't have a pencil, don't worry about it, because we're going to email you that code in a couple of days, along with the recording of Paul's presentation. Next month, our web episode is Discovering the Best of Europe on Foot: How to Unplug, Escape Tourist Traps, and Explore at a Human Pace. We're going to have two authors presenting that evening, and they will explain the benefits of slow travel, which among other things can mean including a trail, including a hike on your vacation. Either it's just part of it or all of it, as people do, of course, in walking something like the Camino de Santiago. So join us for that on Tuesday, October 16. If you can't make it that day in person, register anyway, because we'll email all the registrants a recording of the presentation afterwards. So that's it for us tonight. Thanks for being with us, sharing this evening. Good night and have a great week.